Alright everybody, in this video I'd like to go over an introduction to clay and ceramics in my classroom. We're going to talk about some techniques as well as some things that you need to know about working with clay. We're going to review some of the stages of clay so that you can be the most successful when working with it, and then we are going to talk about how to store our work while we're working on it and then where to put it when we're done. The things that you're going to need on hand include a damp towel, not soaking wet, but something that's damp that you can rub your hands on. You're going to need a piece of parchment paper or wax paper, which will be used to keep your work from sticking to the table. Then you're going to need what's called a bowl of slip. Slip is the lowest stage of clay. It's watered down clay that acts as a kind of glue that we will be using to put different pieces together. So in this bowl I have a couple pieces of dried clay, but you can always use fresh clay as well. And then all you need to do is cover that clay in water and let it dissolve over the next 5 to 10 minutes. Once your slip is ready, it should be mostly dissolved and the water should be a dark brown. You should have a consistency that's similar to pudding, maybe a little bit more runny than that, but you're going to be using this as a type of glue to weld two pieces of clay together. So you're going to need that on hand nearby. And then lastly, you're going to want a variety of tools. Everyone has different preferences. You're going to need a carving tool of some kind. It can be one of these with the metal ends with the loops on them, or you can have a wooden tool that has a pointier end or a smoother end. There's loads of different tools that you can use. You can even use a kitchen fork or a spoon to work with clay. Whatever you have on hand is best. And then you're going to need something that has sharp edges, like a knife or a paper clip. I have these specialty scoring tools, but you're going to need something that has a sharp tip to it so that you can score the clay to join it together, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's talk about the stages of clay before we get into the actual techniques. The first stage that we talked about already is slip. It's watered down clay that's used to join different pieces together. Then you have the plastic stage, which is the stage that you should be at and that you should have in front of you. So the plastic stage is the stage where it can be easily torn, it can be easily smoothed, it's cold when you touch it, and then you can easily smear it and move it around, and it's very malleable. So this is the best stage to form your overall shape with clay. Here I have a leather hard piece. This is a piece that was in the plastic stage that I left to dry overnight inside a plastic bag without a damp paper towel. So this piece it's firm but still cold. It's no longer moldable. It's not extremely fragile. It can withstand a little bit of impact. And this is the perfect stage for carving any kind of details that you'd like using the tools that you have. Once it's at the leather hard stage, it can go back to plastic, but you'd have to soak it in water overnight. So once you get to the leather hard stage, you should be pretty much done and ready for the carving and detailing part of the process. And then once you're ready, you'd put this in the back to dry to bone dry stage. Then we have what's called the bone dry phase. This is a good example of what happens in the bone dry phase. Once the piece has turned from a dark gray and it's cold to the touch, you will have a piece that's completely dry and it's a very pale gray. It's no longer cold to the touch, it's room temperature, and it is extremely fragile. Once it's at this point where it's dried for more than 2 days, any kind of impact will break that piece very, very easily. So that is the stage that you will be putting in the back to be ready to be fired, and the only person that should touch that is me going forward, so that if your piece breaks, it'll be on me and not on you. So we're going to keep students away from the bone dry pieces. So once it's in this stage, it's ready to be fired, meaning that it's going to be put into the kiln and then lifted up to temperature so that it becomes permanent ceramic. And that takes us to the bisqueware stage. So you can see the color difference here. This is a bone dry piece, and this is a bisqueware piece. What that means is that this piece was put in the kiln and brought up to temperature, probably about 1500 to 1800 degrees inside that oven, and then it was cooled down to create this permanent ceramic piece. So all of your dishware, anything that you eat off of is made of ceramic, any vases might be made of ceramic. This will break if you put enough force into it, if you drop it, but it's a lot more durable than bone dry because bone dry takes just the tiniest bit of pressure versus this has become a solid piece of ceramic. The next stage is taking this bisqueware piece and coating it in what's called glaze. Glaze is going to be a silica-based liquid. It's basically got little particles of sand and color pigmentation in it. And once you fire it a second time, that glaze will turn into a glossy type of finish. And so it looks very glassy, very shiny, and that's usually what a lot of final pieces wind up looking like based on the colors that you choose. So now that we know a little bit about the stages of clay and what we're working with, we're going to start with the most basic of techniques. And that is going to be using the pinch and smoothing techniques. Basically using your hands to make pinching motions, as well as using your ability to mold the clay with your hand to create a base vessel. This can't really go very far. This is a very rudimentary task made for smaller things like handles or little features that you're going to attach to your sculptures. But if you're working with the pinch technique, you can roll your clay into a ball and you can start to work it into a smooth surface and you can start to mold it into shape with your fingers. And so you'll start to create kind of a duck mouth with your hand, and you'll start to pinch around the vessel, and you can create a bowl-like shape just by rotating, pinching, rotating, pinching. You'll see that I'm supporting the outside of that vessel with my outer hand, and then I'm using my thumb to press. If you try to press without supporting the other side, then it is going to stretch and collapse. So you have to remember that when you're working, you've got to work both sides of the clay, and you've got to support it while you're working with it by holding the outside. Okay, this brings me into one of my first major rules about clay when it comes to making a successful piece is the thickness of the final piece. The main rule to that is you don't want it to be any thinner than a quarter. So if you have a coin nearby, you can hold it there. It's going to be about that thin. Okay, you don't want to make it any thinner than that because it's going to start to crack and crumble. You can see that the clay starts to bunch together at that junction, and so that part is going to crack during firing, and you don't want it to be that thin. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you don't want it to be any thicker than your thumb. So the thumb of your hand is a good gauge for how thick it should be, because if it's any thicker than that, it's going to dry inconsistently. You can get cracks, and you can even get something called kiln explosions. If your piece looks dry on the outside, but it's not fully dry on the inside, it has the risk of exploding during firing. And so it's extremely important that we adhere to the quarter thin, thumb thick rule. So no thicker than your thumb, no thinner than a quarter, and you will be successful. The next technique is going to be the coil technique. Coils are basically long ropes that you establish, and you build up your vessel using those coils to make whatever shape it is that you want. And this is the main technique that we're going to use in this class. So you're going to take a bundle of clay and you're going to kind of squeeze it between your fingers and get it into kind of a long shape. Then you're going to put it on the table and you're going to start rolling it out into coils. You want to use just the weight of your hands. So don't press down, don't use any force, and make sure that you rock the entire length of the coil. So you see I'm going from the tips of my fingers to the base of my hand and back. If I do just these tiny little half turns like this, it's going to turn into a flat, it's going to turn into a little flatworm, and you don't want that. You'll start to hear a thud, 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 because you're putting too much pressure on it and you're not going far enough. So make sure that you're just using the weight of your hands and you're going the entire length of your hands, front to back. And you're going to want to work your way from the inside out, because the inside is going to wind up being thicker and then it's going to get thinner. So you want it to be an even thickness. Remember, no thicker than your thumb. So aim for something that's about as thick as your pinky and you should be successful. and that's my first coil. Now, I did this intentionally so that you can see that there's a very long crack on my coil here. The reason for that being is that our hands and our skin are naturally moisture absorbent, and so when you're working with clay, your hands will dry out very, very quickly if you don't keep them moisturized. So when you're working with clay, you're gonna start sucking the moisture out of the clay by working it with your hands. So one of the most important things to do while you're working with clay is keeping your hands moist. And so that brings in the damp cloth. You need to occasionally wipe your hand on this and make sure that you're keeping your hands wet, damp, but not soaking, so that when you're working with the clay continues to not crack and not fall apart. One of the things with coils is when you're building a vessel like a bowl such as this one, you are going to need to create a base to start with, and then you can start to build out from that base. So you can see that there's a spiral here to create that base. You're basically going to take your coil, make sure that it's a consistent thickness. You don't want a part that's thicker or thinner. You want to make it as even as you possibly can. And then the length of this coil for your base is going to determine how big your base is, how big that spiral is. So you're going to take your coil and you're going to start to spiral it in. And that's gonna be about the rough size of the base of my piece. If it's not big enough and I want something bigger, then I'm gonna have to re-roll the coil and try and make it a little bit longer with extra clay. But if you're happy with the size of your base, if you want this to be watertight, then you're going to have to smooth the inside out, and then it's up to you whether or not you smooth out the bottom. And so you can see inside this piece that the bottom is smoothed out, but the underside is not. So that's just a choice you have to make. But if you want this to be able to hold liquid, to be able to eat out of it or drink out of it, then you're going to need to smooth the coil out on one side. So in order to smooth out your clay, there's a couple ways to do it. If your clay is damp and fresh, you should be able to just use your finger to start to blend the clay over top of itself. Okay, if your clay has dried out from overuse, you can always take your fingers and dip them into the slip bowl, just a little bit, not too much, because then you'll turn your piece into slip if you use too much water. And you can use that to start to naturally blend out the clay with your finger. If you're having trouble blending with your fingers, you can always use a tool. I like to use these wooden tools with the bent end on them, and you can use that to drag the clay over top of itself. So far, so good. So now I have my smoothed out base, and you can see that I used my fingers to lightly smooth out that surface to make it nice and smooth. You can do it that way, or you can use a sponge and you can lightly dip that in the slip, and you can also use that to smooth out your piece to make sure that it's nice and smooth across the surface. Use whichever you're most comfortable with. Then what you're gonna do is you're gonna start to build your vessel up using coils by taking individual coils and then building them up onto the base. This also leads me to the reason why I told you you should have parchment paper nearby. If you start to create a sculpture on the surface of your work surface, that piece is going to weld to the table eventually. If it continues to just sit there, it's going to start to suction, and then when you try to get it off, it's going to be stuck. And it's going to be really hard for you to get it off without damaging it. So I highly recommend that you have your piece of parchment paper, and then once you start to build your vessel, you work on top of that so that you can move it around freely. So once you have a couple of coils rolled out to even thickness, you're gonna start to build up your object. So we're gonna talk about the last technique today, and that's gonna be the way to attach pieces of clay so that they stay together in the kiln. One of the tricky bits is that when you try to stick two pieces of clay together and just smush them together, the heat of the kiln is going to dry those out and they're just gonna pop apart. So what you need to do to ensure that your pieces are properly welded together is something called score and slip. This is a universal technique that you're going to have to use, otherwise your parts are gonna fall off your piece and you're not gonna know why. So that brings in the tools that you're gonna use for scoring. So if you have one of these fancy scoring tools, that's great, but you can also use a needle tool, you can use a fork, you can use a paper clip or a pin or even a pencil. Something that has a sharp edge like a knife should be perfectly fine. Okay, in order to join two pieces of clay, I'm going to take my coil here and I'm gonna prep it for attachment. So on the bottom of my base here, I'm gonna take my scoring tool and I'm gonna rough up the clay at the location that I'm going to be attaching this coil. And so I'm roughing it up, which is called scoring, using the scoring tool. Okay, that's step one. Then I have to score the opposite piece. So I'm gonna score the length of this coil all the way down. Okay, and then I've completed the scoring part of the technique. The next technique is to take your slip bowl and you're going to get the clay with a brush, or you can even use your finger, that's fine too, whichever you're comfortable with. And you're gonna take that slip and spread it over the scoring on one of the pieces. It doesn't matter which side. In fact, you should probably do both just to be safe. So I'm gonna spread the slip over the scoring. And then I'm going to quickly take my piece, my coil, and I'm going to press it down into the scoring. Okay, so I've got a part where the coil stops and it's too long, so I can always cut that with a flat tool, a knife, something like that. And then I'm going to weld these two pieces together, so the split ends of that coil, the same way that I just did the other pieces. I'm gonna score both sides. And then I'm gonna use some slip to join them together. Think of this like interlocking puzzle pieces. The puzzle pieces won't stick together if there's not a hole that matches. And so the scoring is what's going to ensure that your pieces stay together. Okay, and so now I've got my first ring done. After that, it's really just a process of building up the rings so that you get the shape that you want. You can always settle the coils further out on the edge so that you can make it go bigger and make it bulb out like a bowl. Or if you want it to get skinnier, you can make your coils just a little bit smaller and then slowly make progressively smaller rings. Or you can just make your vessel the same thickness all the way up. It's just personal choice there on what you want and what you're aiming for with your piece. Then on the outside, you can still see the coils visible. You can choose whether or not you blend those together, or you keep the coiled look there for yourself. However, if again, you want this vessel to hold water, you are going to need to blend the inside out. Now, do not wait until you've got all your coils on there before you blend, because you're going to lose the structure of your piece. So you're going to want to blend the coils as you work so that you are making sure that the vessel is staying the shape and size that you want. Otherwise, if you build up a dozen coils and then you start to blend, it's really gonna get bigger and bigger, it's gonna get skinnier, and you're gonna get really angry if you make a mistake, because it's really hard to come back from that once you have started blending at that stage. So that is the basics of working with clay in my classroom. Last thing we're gonna talk about is how to store your work and the different stages of storing that work. So right now, I'm in the process. I'm not done with this. I don't want it to dry out. I don't wanna carve it yet. I wanna keep building up coils until I've got the whole vessel ready to go before I start carving. So what you guys are gonna need to do is take a plastic bag, a shopping bag from the back, and you are going to take a name card, and you're going to be stapling this to your plastic bag to make sure that you know that it's yours. Also, every single student needs to flip their piece over and carve in their first name or their last name, it doesn't matter, and then your period. So if you're in fourth period, third period, if I have a Tyler in first period and then a Tyler in third period and you both don't put your period numbers on, your piece is gonna get lost and confused. So make sure that you're putting your period number and your first, last name, your initials, whatever it is, so that you know that it's yours, and then we're gonna store it in the plastic bag. If you're trying to keep it moist, you are going to put it inside the plastic bag by lifting up the parchment paper that you have your piece in. You're gonna place it inside the plastic bag, And then to keep it moist, we are going to take a paper towel and we're gonna dampen that. You can run it under the sink or you can spritz it with a water bottle. And you can take that damp paper towel and put it right on top of your piece. Okay? We're gonna seal this bag by twist tying it shut. Make sure there's no air in there. Twist tie it shut. And then you are going to staple your name tag to this bag and store it in the back. Okay, let me show you where that is. All right, so I'm ready to store my work. Okay, I've got it done, I've got it in my bag, I've got it tied. I'm gonna go into the kiln room with my bag and I'm going to turn right. Okay, these yellow shelves are where you're going to store your work if you are still working on it. So this is all of the in-progress work, and the shelves are labeled based on your class period. So first period, second period, and so on. You're gonna keep your work by placing it in there, making sure that you have your name tag on there, and then you are good. If you are done with your piece and you are ready for it to be fired in that kiln, you're gonna walk straight back into the drying room and you're gonna be placing your work on these shelves back here. So you say, it says, do not touch fragile. This is where all the bone dry clay is going to go. If you put it on this shelf, you are not allowed to touch it after the fact, unless you want to pick it up and re-wet it and rework it. And then I will take the pieces that are left on this shelf and I will fire them in the kiln.